My name is Natasha Kimani. I'm the head of partnerships and research at Africa No Filter. Before we begin, please remember to use the hashtag as we are. Tag us. So I'm looking fly in my Ankara. Take a nice shot with you guys. Immortalize me. Today we're talking about being African in the diaspora. What does that mean to be African in the diaspora? Before I get my audience up on stage. Sorry, I'm being reminded my mic. I'm a Kenyan, I have a loud voice. It's because of the trauma and pressure that we have. Who here is an African living in the diaspora? Put your hands up, don't be shy. We're not gonna chase you away. Great, we are quite a number. So today, that's what we're talking about. And on stage, I'd like to invite my guests. Buki, I can't see you. Please welcome, yeah, great. Welcome up on stage. Buki, yes, this way. Yes, please. I didn't know there are stairs there. Buki Adejobi, please welcome. Musi Taje, please welcome on stage. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. Shaun Babalola, one of my favorite grantees. Welcome on stage. And last but definitely not least, Omosa Igadora. Please welcome. As you can see, all our headshots are fly, eh? Do I look like a creative? Good, thank you so much. Welcome on stage, Buki, Shaun, and Omose. And today, we're talking about what it means to be African in the diaspora. And I'd like to begin with a question that warms us up. What does home feel like? And where is home for you? You've lived in multiple places. You wear multiple hats. Some would even say faces. Let's begin with you, Buki.
So I'm based in Tokyo right now.
Yeah.
And so every time someone asks, and I've been in Tokyo for 9 years.
Yeah.
Longer than I've been in Canada, where my family is. So the longer I stay in Japan, the more difficult it becomes for me to actually say where is home.
Yeah.
Now, when we did the survey, or actually when Muki asked the question, when you think of Africa, what do you think of? I think I wrote home. And then when there was a question was asked of when you think of a destination, or if you could, transport, or I forgot the actual question, but I thought Canada or Japan, because my family is based in Canada, my partner is in Japan. So it's a question I can't really answer with one answer. Home is Japan, home is Canada, or home is Nigeria. Yeah.
I noticed that you said Nigeria last. We'll come to that.
There is no meaning. There's no underlining meaning behind that.
Okay.
It just, yeah.
Okay, great. So home is where you need to be and where you have roots.
Yes.
In different ways.
Yes.
Shaun, we'll come to home, but in a different angle, because Konissima, your organization is a diaspora-focused company. Why did you actually establish it? What was the purpose and reason behind it? And what has the impact been?
Hi. So Co-Cinema is an organization that is focused on funding opportunities and networking opportunities for Africans and African diaspora. And so the reason I started it is because, I'm Sierra Leonean, I'm also Nigerian, but I'm also born and raised in Brooklyn. So I feel like I always had my feet firmly placed in 2 places or 3 places. But then I also travel. And I found that whether I was in Haiti or Cuba or Sierra Leone or Nigeria, we were all kind of experiencing the same things. Like it's Akara in Nigeria, it's Akaraje in Brazil. Mm. And so I wanted to kind of create a space where we can be ourselves and be at home, but also create with integrity and with autonomy. Because the thing with creativity and narratives and all this stuff is we have to, sometimes when you get money for it, you have to jump through hoops to collect that money. And I didn't want African creatives to have to go through that. So I started the organization, which has 2 grant funds. So one fund is for short films for Black filmmakers anywhere, Africa or diaspora, and the other one is for screenwriters in Botswana. And so with that, it's just like you just have to have a good story, because I think the authenticity will always come through, and we have a vast amount of experiences. And so, like, who am I to dictate what an African story is? Because an African story can be anywhere. And so that's kind of like the thought process behind it, because I identify as multiple things, and I think all of us as Africans identify as multiple things.
I like that.
Yeah.
I really like that. Multiplicity. There's room for a multifaceted human being. Buki, I'm quite curious about your experiences. I mean, sorry, not Buki, sorry, Omose, living abroad. How has that changed you? And how has that centered you in your ethos as a human being?
That's a great question. And actually, I want to answer the home question, if you don't mind me.
Absolutely.
So, hi, thanks for allowing me to be here. You know, this is amazing. I'm a journalist and also the co-founder of AfroVibes Media. But where is home is a tricky question. But I would say home is where I feel safe, for one. Home is where I can be authentically myself as a Nigerian American and not be judged. So I don't really feel like home is a place. I feel like even being here, I feel like ANF is home. I feel like ANF feels safe for me. Mind you, this is only my 2nd time on the continent, but being around like-minded individuals who share similar ideas, who have projects that are, similar to mine, is very impactful and inspiring for me. And so I feel like being around everyone here and just being able to have those intellectual and authentic conversations and learn from each other without judging each other is home. So that has impacted me. So to answer your other question, being a Nigerian American born in Kentucky, which is 86.9% white American, by the way, it impacted me because for a long time I shied away from my heritage. We always talk about stereotypes that we see in the media, and just being around people who is of white descent, then being bullied, then not seeing positive things in media really affected me, and I actually shied away from my heritage for a long time because I felt like my siblings and I didn't fit in anywhere. And when people would ask me, "Where are you from?" it pained me as a 5 or 6-year-old kid because I felt like to Africans, I wasn't American. To Americans, I was Black. And to Blacks, they would hear my name and say, "I'm too African."
Yeah.
And I'll give you an example, because not to keep going on, but I'll give you an example. So like, when Nigerians specifically, because I'm Nigerian, when they hear me say my name, they'll say, this is back before now, they'll be like, "You can't even say your name correctly. You can't say, you see my name is 12 letters long, though." So they would say, "You can't even say your name correctly." And then Americans will hear my name and they'll make fun of me. And then Black people, as soon as they hear my name, because I have the same accent as them, they hear my name and say, "Oh, she's not really African American. Go back to Africa." Yeah. So as a 5 and 6-year-old girl, I'm confused. I'm like, "Dad, why they told me to go back to Africa? I've never been to the continent." And he's like, "Don't worry, don't mind them. Just tell them you're proud to be African." But I'm sorry, you all, like, I did not have that pride as a kid because the stereotypes that we're all talking about doesn't just affect non-Africans, but affects people like me in the African diaspora. And for a very long time, I shied away from that, and I focused more on trying to fit in with those who were around me. And but I'll end there. But things changed in 2010, thank God. But I'll end there.
I'd really like to explore that with all of you, because especially around not being Black enough or being African enough, because oftentimes we'll see, especially on social media, when an African American, African Canadian, or British African is picked for a role, oftentimes African Americans will be like, this role should have gone to an African American, because especially if it's historical based. And then when it comes to the continent, for example, in the movement of NSARS, Africans in the diaspora are being told then, don't claim to be, for example, Nigerian American. Don't identify as Nigerian if you're not going to fight for our rights. So how do you draw the balance, having feet in many places, especially for you, Buki? It's 3, How do you ensure that you have a voice in all of these spaces? I'll begin with you, and especially I'll come to you, but in the context of film, I'm very interested in that. So Buki, how do we explore that? How do you ensure that you're authentic, your voice is heard?
I think at the end of the day, no one can help you feel that. You have to come to yourself and be
I feel like
content.
we're the poets in the room. Just snap your fingers. Please repeat that.
I forgot what I said.
You have to come to yourself.
You have to be satisfied with where you are, who you are, and how you present yourself to the world. If you don't feel African enough, Nigerian enough, or black enough, no one's going to help you feel that. In Canada, I was very often called Oreo, black on the outside, white on the inside. I had Nigerians who would tell me, same thing, you're not Nigerian enough, you don't act Nigerian. But did that make me feel less Nigerian? I mean, it affected, how I carried myself among other Nigerians. But when I introduce myself in certain places, I still identify as Nigerian, I identify as African. So to answer your question, it comes down to you. You have to find your own truth. And that journey could be many things for different people. It could be traveling to the continent. It could be interacting with people from the continent wherever you are. It could be listening to music, to Afrobeat or Afro music from the continent. It could be watching movies. It could be learning to speak the language. Whatever that is to you, you find your truth and you stick to it. And when you are having conversations, when people are having conversations, if you have something to share it. Because at the end of the day, I had a conversation yesterday, but when you go to bed, no one is the voice. The voice in your head is your voice.
I love it.
If you're not happy with that, no one can really help you.
I like that. Thank you. And I think just pegging on that, Shaun, you're also a filmmaker. How easy has it been to pitch stories and get funding for stories that reflect the diaspora?
Okay, so I think I'm very privileged to have had parents that always told me who I was in terms of you're an African in this house, you're an African. But going outside, yes, it's you're perceived differently depending on where you are. So in Europe, people think I'm a refugee or something, and then in Africa, you're an American. In America, you're black in different spaces. So I think in the U.S. context, because I work primarily in television, there is not. And I think this is why it's so important for us to tell stories. There isn't really a grasp yet on the nuances of blackness. So it's there's a vague knowledge of black people in America, the descendants of enslaved Africans. But if you talk about the black British experience or the black, Haitian experience or a Kenyan experience, they're what is, I don't even, it does not compute. And so pitching that, especially when pitching an African-focused story, it's okay, well, there's literally just no visual. They can't understand Africans being normal people having a love triangle or just going to a corner store and having a comedy. It's just not a concept. And so when you pitch these things in these rooms, which are primarily white people, but often sometimes black people, they're just well, what's the American spin on it? Can we put some Americans in it? And then does the African is it about female genital mutilation? Is it about trauma? Is it about, all the other things we're used to? So it's the stereotypes still carry. But I think it is very important, what Buki was saying, is no one can really tell you, or make you feel comfortable about your identity or who you are. You really have to find that within yourself. And you definitely get a strong armor, because constantly walking into rooms, particularly in the television space where it's primarily white and male, you have to know who you are to keep persevering and going through it. But there is one point that I want to make, is that I think organizations like this and events and conferences like this are really important, because we really need to rely on each other a lot more. Because these structures that exist, at least in the entertainment space, were never meant to really include us. We weren't a part of it. So it's we can't try and fight our way into something that is not for us. And so if you take, for example, a Netflix or something, once they decide, okay, we have enough African subscribers and leave, then what? where is our stuff going to go?
Yeah.
So we should create our own platforms, and we should, create our own systems to actually like rely on each other and collaborate a lot more. And so I think these stereotypes affect both sides, because when I landed here, sorry I'm going on, but the driver, I love talking to whatever country I go to, talking to the taxi drivers, because they always give me the real. And he was like, yeah, you're American, so like, I feel like, aren't the black people lazy there? And I was like, I mean, the same sentiment could be thought of Africans, which I've heard, that we don't work, we just rely on aid. And he thought about it, and he was just like, that's true. And I think sometimes we don't even think about some of the things we just carry just over and over. So just all encompassing, I think we need to be a lot more aware of each other and our experiences, because it's incredibly valuable.
Absolutely, and that's such a good point, because we are also not aware of our stereotypes. When I lived in London, when I had my brief stint in the States, everyone kept telling me, keep away from black Americans. They're going to, for example, introduce you to marijuana. My parents didn't know I was already introduced to it. So, like, in the context of it all, I feel we carry stereotypes. And I think almost I'd really like to speak about Afro.
Just really quickly, just want to touch on how you present that in the diaspora. I mean, Seiko and I, she's gone somewhere. Seiko, my business partner, she's somewhere there. But we're based in Japan, and Japan, it's an homogeneous country, absolutely mostly Japanese. And so what we've learned, through what we do in our Tori is, yes, we want to show ourselves as African, we want to tell our stories, but it's also important to tell it in a way they would understand. Because if you're trying to tell your truth the way you see it, it might not sink in, it might not resonate with them, because there is still that gap in understanding, in the connection, in how is value perceived. And so what we've been trying to do now is telling that story, telling stories of who we are as African from the creative space, in the creative industry, in the Japanese content, in the way they would understand it, while still not diluting it, while still keeping authenticity, because
Sorry, before she said that, my question is, again, about dilution, because I find with a certain platform that I'm not going to name, there's such an Americanization of African shows. Like in high schools, we don't speak that way, with a funny accent. It's not African, it's not the lived experiences of African. So it's the main target is Americans, clearly, and not Africans. But so then we are unable to relate to that. So how do you get the balance? I'm quite curious to ensure that it's being authentic. Africans can still relate, and so can the Japanese.
So, when you mean relate to that, do you mean in the content we produce or in the content that exists already?
Both.
Okay, in the content that exists already, there really isn't much that exists. I think any African content you get from Japan, there are some Africans, Nigerians, and Ghanaians who've actually started like some radio platforms locally, and they produce content, they produce content locally, and they have partners locally who, show videos of, it's mostly agriculture centric. And that's also the problem that we've seen in Asia, is when they think of when they think of something from the continent, they think agriculture, they think automotive, but whereas the creative space. But in terms of what we produce, we've mostly done shows, and we work with fashion shows, and we work with designers, and we work with them to produce. They come up with the theme of the show, they come up with the idea, and we just interpret that into Japanese, we just present that to the Japanese audience. But what we've been trying to do now is write articles in Japanese using information and resources from people on ground, because we're not on ground, we have limited resources, so we can't make up stuff without working with people on the ground.
No, sorry, I just got very excited about this, because I understand what you're saying, but I also kind of have a bone to pick with how Africans are always asked to like dilute ourselves to be relatable. Because when you watch K-dramas, when you watch like all these other things, Koreans aren't like changing their, culture. If you relate, you relate. You know, if you don't, you don't. And so I feel like a lot of the time, like we should just be who you are. If you get it, you get it. If you don't, don't watch it.
Just to clarify, what I mean, like,
No.
what I mean, like, make it relatable. Don't change it.
No.
Right? Keep the core essence.
core.
But maybe present it in a way that makes sense. So, for example, we launched our e-commerce platform 2 months ago, and one of the challenges we're having is people think they're too expensive. But the truth is, when you look at the Japanese textile like the art, the craftsmanship in Japanese traditional fashion industry, there are many overlaps with Africa, with the continent. And so what we're trying to do is now present what they know, what they associate as valuable to what we have that's at the same level, and put it on the same table and say, okay,
Thank you so much.
this is,
I want to come to you.
I feel like I didn't want to interrupt. There were other great conversations, so,
I want to come to you in the amazing work you're doing with Afrovibes. My first question is that, is there a craving from the diaspora to actually understand what's happening on the continent? Or is it just a diaspora bubble? Is there a hunger for awareness, relatability, aside from wearing Ankara on Africa Day? Are they going beyond that?
That's a great question, and how I would answer that is using my own experience as someone who was born and raised as an African diaspora. And going back to what Buki said, she said, which I 100% agree with, find what connects you to the continent and stick with it. She said, as an example, Afrobeats. For me, in 2010, music changed my perspective. And this is before Afrobeats became mainstream, and I'll tell a brief story because I see the time there. So in 2010, I was still in Kentucky, but there was one year me and my sisters were in college all at the same time. It was 3 of us at the same time in college. And we went on a spring break trip with a few international students from the continent, right? And so during that trip, we were listening to the same CD over and over and over in the van on our way there. And there was one song in particular that stuck out to me and my sisters. A song by Ice Prince. Does anyone know it?
Ole cool.
Ole cool, exactly. So that song changed my perspective, and the music is what gravitated me to learn more about my culture and about my roots, because in this day, a lot of the music is still in the Yoruba language. So it started from the music, then the language, then I want to learn more about the food, then I want to learn more about the clothes, and so on and so forth. So I don't know if there is, so to answer your question, I use my own experience. I think if there isn't, there should be, because these stereotypes that we're talking about doesn't only affect non-Africans. Again, it affects people like me. So then, from then on out, that's why I started Afrovibes Media, is because I realized, even though my story about belonging and I had a whole identity crisis as a kid, it wasn't really unique. I realized that there were actually a whole group called the African diaspora, which current research shows is 170 million people worldwide who basically means that they're of African descent but don't live in Africa. So they live in the US, they live in Canada, they live in UK, they live in France. And that's a whole group of people who actually had similar experience growing up than I did. So Afrovibes started because I was trying to tell stories. I started by interviewing African celebrities because music is what helped me, so I figured it's going to help other people. But from then on out, I'll end here that we actually now evolved.
But I also like that, before you end, so are we actually saying that pop culture may actually be the key or gateway to connecting there's a strong the diaspora and Africans on the continent?
So pop culture, yes, but also we have evolved into just talking, generally speaking, positive stories about Africa, but also businesses. Because businesses will now help us also encourage more investments and help reshape how everyone sees the continent.
Because what worked for me when I was in London was there was a Ghanaian show, Akosua here. It was called An African City. It was beautiful black girls. Yeah, it was fabulous. And I was like, oh my God, this is the Africa I want to go back to. So when we're thinking of it that way, then, can we say we need to also start finding different ways? Because when we speak about the diaspora, especially for politicians, it's about remittance. How much money and then bringing back. You know, how can we stop looking at you guys as objects to just benefit us, but also as people we could learn from and partner with? Because we rarely talk about partnerships. I'd be quite interested to see African creators partner with creators in the diaspora. How do we then begin making that connection? I'd be curious, yes. And this is like our final lap of applause. So we need points to go this way.
So I'll answer your first question. Do we use pop culture? So not only am I an entrepreneur, but I'm also a journalist. And my first stint was at Bloomberg. And I wrote the first ever Afrobeats focus story for Bloomberg last year. So I used pop culture to gravitate people because that's what's trending now. So that's what they understand. So, and at the time, Burna Boy had just sold out Madison Square Garden, which is in New York. And so I found out how much revenue he got. Like, no, because people always talk about, okay, music is trending. When we talk to the, white folks, like they want to see numbers. So I had to dig deep and realize that he sold 1.6 million. He made 1.6 million in revenue for tickets. So we use stuff like pop culture to help gravitate and tell our story because that's what's currently trending.
Yeah, so I think I'm going to try and make this fast. So I'm not only am I executive director of Co-Cinema, which is an organization, as you can see, is a director-producer of Showju. So that's a documentary series that I did in 10 different countries celebrating youth culture in Africa. So I was traveling with the camera on my shoulder going to all these different countries. And what I learned is that we know very little about each other. So I think that's the first thing that we actually have to start talking about instead of like business and collaborations is how do we, actually value each other's experiences and also like care and value what we bring to the table. Because to be quite honest, there was a lot of people who asked me, where's your white crew? Where's your white crew? And I'm like, as an African, are we respecting each other? Do we like hold each other accountable? Are we asking more? And I think these are all the questions that we need to start asking because business in Africa is not easy. And so before we start talking about like how we build partnerships and how we do all that stuff, it's like, okay, how can I trust this next businessman? Because as an American, is he trying to, do with all this stuff? There's all these things, and I think there's a lot of nuance that we're trying to discuss. But we really need to like relate to each other a lot more before we like take that monetary fee, at least in my opinion.
Sorry, please repeat the question. How can we find ways to connect and work together?
Okay. I think I've spoken with a couple of people about this before during this last 2 days, but I think very often we think of, when we think of partnerships and collaborations, we think of them only within the continent. And as much as I understand it as, yes, we're trying to bring money into the continent with the creative space, there are ways of doing that without not focusing only within the continent. I mean, what we do at Awatori, we're based in Tokyo, we're not in the continent, but what we do is we want to work with creatives in the continent to get customer base outside the continent, while also, of course, telling the stories of the artmanship, the quality of work that exists in the continent, and basically taking their money to reinvest into the continent. And so just having that mindset that you don't have to be on ground to make an impact. And I also think as Africans, it's what makes us strong, but it's also our kind of bottleneck. We are aggressively competitive with each other.
Strong agree.
We're always afraid that someone would come and like take our spot. But it's not always the case. It's a conversation, and I will stop there.
I just want to quickly land it because the way I open is like, oh my God, I don't like being Nigerian. But I will say this, I actually went to Nigeria for the very first time by myself in 2018, and I got to obviously understand that, there were other sides to the continent. So from that experience, I learned that no matter what people tell you, no matter what the media does say, you are African, you can't change it. No matter if people believe you, and yes, there are bad parts, to the country, but you being African, the best thing to do is to go there and to make an impact and do something about it. And if you can't go there, obviously you can do things like AfroVibes to tell better stories. So thank you.
I just want to say Omose is Nigerian because she said, I just want to land. When a Nigerian is about to make a point, they say, I just want to. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time. It's been an incredible conversation in these